In the first century of the Christian era, Hindus, Chinese and Muslims began to explore the Indonesian archipelago. They were searching for spices and for gold. Although they touched upon the northern coast of Australia, they did not even begin to explore its rugged interior. Next came the Portuguese, then the Spanish, in search of this Terra Australia. But it was finally the Dutch who discovered the continent in the early 1600s, but they did not claim it. The Dutch explorer Abel Tasman followed, but he continued on to discover New Zealand. A century later, in 1770, Captain James Cook arrived from England to literally put Australia on the map and claim a major part of it for the British Crown. He named it New South Wales. During the 18th century, the British jails were filled to overflowing, so it was decided to establish a penal colony in Australia, 12,000 miles away. In 1787, 11 small ships of the British First Fleet, under the command of Captain Phillips, arrived in Botany Bay, Eastern Australia, after an incredible journey of 8 months at sea. On board were 1,300 passengers, including 200 military, a few women and children, but the rest were convicts. And it didn't take much to be a convict in those days, just petty theft or owing someone a small amount of money. Now, there were two immediate problems. Firstly, fresh water was not as plentiful as Captain Cook had indicated, and there were 2 French naval ships nearby, searching for new territories. So Captain Phillips hurriedly sailed north, a few miles to Port Jackson, which is now Sydney Harbour. Here he discovered the perfect site for the new settlement. He named it Sydney Cove in honour of Lord Sydney, the British Home Secretary. Shots were fired as the Union Jack was raised, proclaiming British sovereignty over the whole eastern half of the continent. Since then, on January the 26th each year, Australia Day celebrates this event, the birth of the nation down under. Those convicts were soon rounded up and put to work, erecting tents, buildings, and working the soil. Within a few weeks, some of the convicts began stealing food, so Phillips introduced flogging as a warning of his determination to defend property and maintain the law. When this failed, one convict was executed in public as an example. The white man had arrived in Australia. Today we can relive some of this colourful history in old Sydney town, which is just out of present-day Sydney. Captain Phillips is still watching over his historic settlement at the Rocks in Sydney, for this is the nation's birthplace and the place where the colony of New South Wales was born. The lovely old stone walls give an 18th century look to the sidewalk cafes, while the cobblestones seem to fascinate the young children. Many of the original buildings of sandstone have since been restored to house galleries, gift shops and restaurants. This art studio occupies an original site cut by the convicts from the solid sandstone. Now let's visit Cadman's cottage. It's the oldest dwelling in Sydney. Cadman was an ex-convict who was put in charge of the government boats in Sydney Harbour. He lived here with his wife and family. Local and visiting artists come to the Rocks to record their visual impressions of Australia's finest example of a restored colonial village. Towering above the Rocks is the old coat hanger, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Built back in 1932, it's still the world's largest arch bridge. We can cross it by bus, train, car or bicycle, as well as on foot, for breathtaking views over the harbour and the city. Let's face it, to many people, Sydney is Australia. In the 200 years of settlement, Sydney has grown from 1,300 people to 3.5 million. Since World War II, there has been heavy immigration from Europe and in more recent years from Southeast Asia. The Aussies call it the Asian invasion. Most visitors from overseas seem to land here, while 60% of American tourists use Sydney as their port of entry. The ideal way to see the city and its impressive skyline is from a harbour ferry or a cruise boat, or perhaps 1,000 feet up on the Sydney Tower, below the revolving restaurant. If you do this first, it will make it easier for you to find your way about the city. This is the naval base for the Royal Australian Navy at Woolloomooloo. It's only a few minutes walk from here back to the downtown. The inner city is the hub of contemporary Australia and its financial heart. Getting around in Sydney has no worries, mate, with regular buses, trains and harbour ferries, not to mention over 4,000 taxi cabs. Walking Sydney is also an enjoyable experience, as distances are not too great, but good walking shoes are essential. Because we're down under, the seasons are reversed, so it's summer here in the middle of January. We also walk to the left of the sidewalk, or the footpath as they call it. If you're tired of walking, there are many fine parks, gardens and other resting places for you to enjoy, together with a great cultural mix of libraries, art galleries and museums. With westerly winds and coastal sea breezes, there's a clarity in the air over Sydney, and you seldom see it looking smoggy. It's only a few minutes from the downtown by monorail to the new development at Darling Harbour. They tell me they got the idea for the monorail from Seattle. This is still part of the working harbour, but it now has a massive new conference centre, a ship museum, a museum of technology, an old brewery, a wonderful aquarium, and also a Chinese garden. This is where the people of Sydney come to celebrate their festivals and their national holidays. Sydney's landmark used to be its harbour bridge, but this all changed back in 1973 when a set of billowing white sails appeared close by. Their shell-like shapes towered over 200 feet above the harbour and were covered with over 1 million ceramic tiles. After 16 years in construction and $95 million over budget, the Sydney Opera House was finally ready for launching. Now, the name Opera House is really a misnomer, for this architectural gem is really more of a performing arts centre with occasional opera. It's also called the Gracious White Elephant, the Seagull's Delight, the Photographer's Challenge and the Window Cleaner's Nightmare. Between the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge is Circular Quay. This is where the ferry boats come and go, so there's always a good flow of people here, especially on the weekends, to see the street entertainers and the buskers. I guess if you can't take the music, you can always maybe take the money. But your conscience will bring you back. After lunch at one of the many quayside restaurants along the waterfront, we can save a few pennies for the Small Change Band right next door. For some, it's been a really hard day. After the performance, the proceeds must be carefully counted and then divided into 3. For 3.5 million Sydney-siders, the ocean is never far away. Of its many coastal beaches, Bondi is the most popular. Two hours west of Sydney are the Blue Mountains. On the way, we're going to visit an outback ranch, or station as the Aussies call it. Until recently, visitors had to travel long distances to experience outback life in a real working sheep ranch. But here at Tobruk, the Australian Grazing Company runs a shearing centre which has become a major tourist attraction close to Sydney. The merino sheep are trucked in from all over New South Wales and from as far away as central Queensland. The Australian-bred sheep dogs are called Kelpies and are well trained to do most of the work in rounding up the sheep. As well as the roundup and the sheep shearing, there are guided tours of the station, including a cuddle with a woolly lamb. A hay ride over the paddocks, and the excitement of breaking in a wild horse or its rider. The work centre of the station is the wool shed, where the sheep is parted from its wool. Some sheds can handle over 150,000 sheep each season. A good shearer can shear over 200 sheep in a day. The shed is a busy workplace and the work is hard, but here at Tobruk there are demonstrations and the chance to try your hand at shearing. Today, Australia still has over 160 million sheep, and they are mostly merinos. West of Tobruk are the Blue Mountains. They get their name from the smoky blue haze, which is part of their image. To get a picture of the 3 rocky sisters in blue, it's best to take an early morning ride on the cable car. Bush walks and backpacking are also very popular here in the Blue Mountains. North of Sydney is the dairy country, and you will know when you're out of town. One of the reasons for my Grand Australian tour is to find Australia's most amazing mailbox, and here are 2 contenders in the dairy country, the 1 and the 2 canned variety. If you're a beer drinker, there's the barrel or the keg model. This is not a mailbox, but it is the world's largest oyster. I thought it was going to be a seafood restaurant, but it turned out to be a real estate office. You're going to be driving on the left side of the highway, so it pays to read the signs or you may end up in an embarrassing position. The first major city north of Sydney is Brisbane, on the banks of the Brisbane River. As well as being the carefree capital of the state of Queensland, it's the country's 3rd largest city. But like most other Australian cities, there will be a statue of Queen Victoria watching over you. Brisbane is also called the world's biggest country town. With warm summers and mild winters, the climate is ideal. Amid the high-rise and the low-rise office buildings are many historic structures which are beautifully preserved, as the past and the present get along nicely together. Many of the city streets which cross on a grid system are named after kings and queens of England. When Australia and the USA became allies during World War II, General Douglas MacArthur set up his Pacific headquarters right in the heart of this city, together with 15,000 US service personnel. After the war, many Australian war brides moved to the USA to become citizens, while some of the US servicemen remained here to become Australians. About 1 hour's drive south of Brisbane are the beach resorts of the Gold Coast. This subtropical coast of southern Queensland also has some of the best wildlife parks and reserves in Australia. These white ibis are nesting in the Currumbin Sanctuary on the Sunshine Coast. As we tour Australia, we're going to see a lot of wildlife, especially in the outback and the Northern Territory, so it's a good idea to visit one of these sanctuaries first to get a close look at the unusual animals and birds of Australia. Then we can identify them more easily in the wild. Here's the emu, which is Australia's version of the ostrich. The emu is the only surviving member of an ancient family of birds. Among the marsupials are 3 kinds of wombat. Well, this doesn't look much like a bat to me, but it is the world's largest burrowing animal. And here's the echidna, or spiny anteater. The largest marsupials are the macropods, including the kangaroos, and there are over 50 different kinds of kangaroo. The reds and the greys are the largest. If you're going to take a picture with the children and a kangaroo, it's a good idea to pick a small one. Otherwise, the kids may be knocked over. If you want to feed the lorikeets, you'll need to be there sharp at 9 a.m. They fly in right on time for their breakfast. There are many walk-through aviaries, so bird photography is easy. You may see the laughing kookaburra, but he won't be laughing at this time of the day. He does this usually before dawn. But this is what we've really come to see, the koalas. Of all the Australian animals, the koalas seem to have the greatest appeal. Despite its misused title, the koala is not a bear. It's a herbivorous marsupial. This young koala is trying to get back on mother's shoulders. The neighbours are not very impressed with the child care. Determination finally puts him back up on top, where he belongs. Now, where is Father? He's down below at breakfast, eating the leaves of the eucalyptus tree. Happiness for him is being surrounded by food. Many visitors want to have a picture with a koala, so many of the wildlife parks provide this opportunity for a small donation towards koala research. Some of the wildlife parks specialise in the many different kinds of kangaroo, and if we get there early, we may be in time for the early morning scratch. This albino kangaroo is a rare sight, even in a wildlife park, but the smaller wallabies are much more common. Australia has over 17 million people and more than 19 million kangaroos. Now we're travelling 1,000 miles north overland to the tropical north of the state of Queensland, towards Cairns. This is the sugarcane country. As the state's main export, the sugarcane is harvested and processed all year round. Australia exports about 3 million tonnes of raw sugar each year, and it mostly comes from the state of Queensland. After a day's sightseeing outside the city of Cairns, we realise that we should have allowed more time to see the many attractions of northern Queensland. But now we're leaving Cairns. Our great adventure catamaran is heading for one of the natural wonders of the world, the Great Barrier Reef. The reef itself is 1,200 miles long, running parallel to the Queensland coast. There are over 300 different kinds of coral and at least 1,400 species of fish in this area alone. Our cruiser ties up at a floating platform just above one of the most beautiful parts of the outer reef. Visitors from around the globe come here for their first underwater experience, to snorkel above the coral. Many of these folk cannot even swim, so they must wear a life jacket to float above the reef. Qualified snorkelers and divers can venture deeper to explore the largest living thing on this earth. As we glide amongst the fish and the coral heads, we begin to realise the wonder of it all. If you're not a diver, you can still enjoy this experience from the viewing semi-submersible. Between the outer reef and the city of Cairns is Green Island. This is a typical reef island, so we visit here on our return. The Great Barrier is actually two complete reef systems. These are made up of 200 smaller reefs. It's hard to convey the incredible beauty of a garden of sea anemones or an undersea forest of seaweed. Green Island is the ideal place to study the corals and the great variety of marine life at close quarters. From Cairns, the highway heads west towards the Northern Territory. But there are many highlights on the way, including the largest city in the world. Well, that's according to the Guinness Book of Records, in the middle of nowhere, the giant mining centre at Mount Isa. To qualify as the world's largest city, the city fathers have bent the rules slightly. They have included thousands of acres of surrounding desert within their city limits. Mount Isa Mines is the world's largest mine producer of silver and lead. It has a daily output of 35,000 tonnes of ore. 20% of the city's people, and there are 27,000 of them, work for the company. This includes 1,200 people working underground. Now here's another unusual mailbox as we begin our journey to the edge of the outback. We're heading for the cattle country. West of Mount Isa are thousands of square miles of flat, dry grazing country. Droughts, floods and fires, together with the intense heat, have shaped a hardy breed of cattle folk who are true survivors. These outback ranchers tell me that their kids learn to swim in the mirage at the back of the homestead, while the crows out here fly backwards. That's to keep the dust out of their eyes. Australia has about 24 million head of cattle, and the beef is sold to over 100 different countries. And this is about the last place you would expect to find Australia's most amazing mailbox. It's a retired steamroller in its final resting place. It serves as the mailbox for all of the people on the station. Now we're leaving the edge of the outback and heading for the Northern Territory and its capital city of Darwin. Sunrise, September 19th, 1942, had special meaning for the people of the Northern Territory. At first they thought it was thunder, but then they realised the Japanese were bombing their capital city of Darwin, for the port of Darwin was the most significant target after Pearl Harbor. In the first attack, 83 enemy aircraft kept up an hour-long bombing raid. This was the first of over 60 bombing raids in the future on Darwin by the Japanese during World War II. The city and its people were devastated. It couldn't have been much worse. 32 years later, an even greater disaster. On Christmas Day 1974, Cyclone Tracy virtually flattened the city. 66 people died and over 10,000 homes were damaged. Since then, most of the city has been rebuilt to a new cyclone building code. The Christchurch Cathedral was built in 1902 and it was almost demolished by the cyclone. So the new cathedral has retained what is left of the old. There are still a few reminders of the old city and some surviving historic buildings. You won't find much high-rise in Darwin, but you will find a tropical city of beauty and charm. If the temperature doesn't tell you that it's tropical, the beauty of its flowers certainly will. Australians seem to take their outdoor bowls very seriously. This is the Darwin Outdoor Bowls Club, and it could be anywhere in Australia, except the players here are very tolerant of the local wildlife. The goannas stay on the sideline as spectators. While some of the birds actually get involved in the play. A little bit to the left, dearie. I think we should have a committee meeting about these birds and have the rules modified to make allowances. That's it for today, ladies. We will see you all next Saturday. A few minutes' walk from the centre of the city is Aquascene at Doctor's Gully. Just over 20 years ago, a local resident began throwing bread scraps to the fish at high tide. And just look what has happened. It began with just a few small mullet, but has since grown to a unique spectacle, as thousands of fish attract thousands of visitors each year. The number of different species has increased to more than 20, including milkfish, catfish, bream and batfish, and a host of others. And there are many different kinds of fishy tails here. The outgoing tide will drop about 25 feet, and with it will go the fish in anticipation of their next regular meal. But if you'd like to catch a fish here, it could be expensive. Highlight of the Northern Territory is Kakadu, Australia's largest and most diverse national park. The sheer size of Kakadu reminds us that Australia is the world's oldest, flattest and driest continent. The name Kakadu is from the Aboriginal people who have lived in this ancient land for at least 25,000 years. No one knows exactly how long, but new evidence suggests it could be up to 70,000 years. The heart of Kakadu is a vast sandstone plateau formed some 200 million years ago when Australia was part of the great southern continent. And everywhere there is water or a billabong, there is abundant bird life. It's a paradise for birds and is also well known as the main filming location for that famous Australian movie, Crocodile Dundee. At the last count, there were 275 species of birds, so the bird watching is great. Many of the birds are very tolerant of humans, so picture taking is easy. The galahs and the cockatoos are especially tame. There is also a river cruise to experience the wilderness of Kakadu. High above, in the cooling shade of these sandstone cliffs, is the greatest collection of Australian ancient art the world has ever seen. The dry escarpment has preserved more than 5,000 rock paintings in a variety of different styles, some of them up to 23,000 years old. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the work of these ancient artists provides a magnificent record of Aboriginal life patterns over many thousands of years. These paintings confirm that the Aboriginals were a wise and thoughtful people, especially when it came to the land. They were masters of their own physical and spiritual universe. In the nearby bush are the fruit bats. There are two different kinds of nocturnal fruit bats here, and they fly in after sunrise to spend the day sleeping. They have been feeding on the nearby fruit crops during the night. There are the usual fights and squabbles. That's to get the best positions, but eventually they hang loose and they draw the shades. We all know that bats mostly live in caves, but the Aboriginal people know that these bats will not venture into the art drawing caves for fear of the protective spirits which dwell within. The Northern Territory has many crocodile-infested rivers, so now we're going to explore one of these. Since 1971, when the crocodile became protected, their numbers have increased dramatically. At the last count, there were some 30,000 crocodiles in the rivers of Kakadu. We're now on board the Princess for a 2-hour jumping crocodile cruise on a river which has at least 1,500 fearless crocs. There's an air of excitement as we await our first glimpse of these famous jumping crocodiles. Here's the first customer, and he's a big one. The skipper turns the boat for a better view. For a little encouragement, a small bait is dangled above the water. Some days these crocs are lazy and they won't even swim to the boat to jump for their lunch. But today we are lucky. They are very active. A hungry, jumping croc is a mean machine, and they mean business. They can leap in many different ways. Sometimes, with a flick of the tail, they can leap right out of the water. So you can see why the skipper won't let me film from the front of the boat. Northern Australia has 2 species of crocodiles. This one is the freshwater croc from the freshwater rivers and streams. The other is the saltwater croc, which is much larger and even more dangerous. But all crocodiles are extremely dangerous. The skipper tells me the crocs would really prefer the live bait on the top deck of the boat. Now, this Aussie skipper is quite a character. I asked him, where do I go to film the big crocs on the following day? He replied, come back to the office and I'll show you on the map, but I must warn you it will be dangerous. First, I must tell you there are 3 ways for you to get away from a croc. The first is to climb up a tree, but crocs can go without food for 3 days, so they'll probably get you when you come down. The second way is to run faster than 10 miles an hour, which they can do in a short burst on land. But the third way is much easier. Just take along a friend who cannot run very fast. So after the excitement of the croc cruise, I managed to rent a small boat, and I was also fortunate to find a friend who could not run very fast. She also could not swim. We paddled into this crocodile-infested river. It soon became obvious that this was the place to see the really big ones. The ones on the bank were even bigger. The river had taken us to a crocodile farm with over 7,000 crocs of all sizes. We had come in through the back door. Now I'd like you to meet the real star of that film, Crocodile Dundee. This is the huge croc that snapped at the young lady in the film. He's in retirement now, but he's still very active. He's over 20 feet long and he doesn't like being splashed with cold water. Scientists believe that crocodiles have been present on Earth for over 100 million years. They are a living link to a primeval past, the largest and most efficient survivor of the age of the dinosaurs. Now, the keeper usually protects himself with a stick, but it doesn't always work, so he backs off quickly. It's lunchtime, so the keeper will feed the croc, but I really think that the croc would prefer to eat the keeper. I recently heard that one of the keepers lost his left arm completely to one of these crocs. Close by is snowy MacArthur. This is the world's largest white crocodile, or perhaps we should say off-white. This 14-foot showpiece was caught in the MacArthur River. That's how he got his name. But he's quite happy here in retirement at the croc farm. But he's still very dangerous. So when you see the sign, you know that it means what it indicates. The major highway heading south is called the Stewart. It bisects Australia from Darwin in the north to Adelaide, 2,000 miles over the desert in the south. There's no speed limit up on the open road of the Northern Territory, but all the other states have speed controls. Those long highway stretches tend to encourage speeding, but this is not a good idea, as many of the roads are unfenced, and there can be the danger of wandering stock. Another hazard is that the gas stations can be 200 miles apart, so whenever you see a pump, you always top your tank. Then there are the road trains. These are multi-trailered trucks which service the outback. They can be up to 150 feet long, and they can haul up to 3 trailers, even on those dusty roads. So if you see one of these coming towards you at high speed, simply move off the highway and let it go through. Otherwise, you should have no problems driving the roads of the outback. Our next stop is the camel farm near Alice Springs. Oh dear, another boring day with the tourists is about to begin. This is the Fullerton Camel Farm. The boss is Mr. Noel Fullerton, but he's away this week on a camel safari through the outback, so his daughter Michelle is running the farm. Each day the visitors roll in here by the coachload for their first and sometimes their last camel ride. Michelle is quite a famous young lady. She is the world champion camel rider, and she recently won the International Camel Cup for camel racing. The 50-odd camels usually eat hay, which is $6 a bale out here. So between them, they munch their way through 50 bales each day, and that's a lot of hay both ways. Now the seniors will take their turn at riding. Steady as we go, Mother. This lady is not sure that it's a good idea. But Michelle is very reassuring. She explains that the hardest part of camel riding is actually getting up there and getting started. Then it's quite easy. The camel is not native to Australia. It was introduced from the Middle East by the early explorers in 1840. With so much desert, the camel soon proved itself to be the most efficient mode of transport in the outback. At the end of the ride, we return to Earth, gently if possible. The camel says, "Don't panic." And the lady begs the camel, "Please be gentle with me." The camel says, "Trust me, lady." But I really don't need a camel breathing down my neck. She's had enough. She wants to go home. Whose idea was this? Oh dear, another boring day with the tourists has finally come to an end. There are many great ways to move around Australia, and the train is no exception. Train standards are high, especially on the eastern coast. This is the Ghan train. It comes up from Adelaide to Alice Springs on one day each week, and it returns the following day. Some travellers take the train one way, and they like to fly the other. So here we are in Alice. Alice Springs is a modern town of some 24,000 people and is the ideal base to begin our exploration of the outback. Alice is kind of like an oasis in the outback desert. Close to Alice is a water hole on the Todd River. This was the original Alice Spring. And wherever there is water, there is abundant bird life. The galahs in their hundreds. The first Europeans settled here with the building of the Overland telegraph line. It went from Adelaide in the south, 2,000 miles across the desert, all the way to Darwin in the north. From Darwin, the line connected through Southeast Asia, North Africa, and then on to London, 13,000 miles away. In 1872, when Australia was finally linked to the world by telegraph, it could take up to 4 months to get a letter from this new British colony of South Australia all the way to London. By telegraph, the message would only take 7 hours. Today, we can look over the original settlement, which is now a museum. The construction of the telegraph line was a remarkable achievement in which camels were used to carry most of the heavy equipment. This included 36,000 wooden telegraph poles. There were barracks for the workers and a residence for the station master. Now, he was a man of great importance, so he got to name the settlement after his wife, Alice. In the cool of the twilight, we take a walk to the edge of the outback to enjoy the silence. The only tracks here are made by kangaroos and wallabies as they move amongst the rocks. Wallabies are like small kangaroos, but they have pointed faces and longer tails. The word kangaroo was first recorded by Captain James Cook when he met the Aboriginal people. It became the first Aboriginal word to be included in the English language. The Australians have grown to love their kangaroo, their symbolic national pest, but it is strictly protected. We're going to spend the night in Alice Springs, and next morning we'll visit the Royal Flying Doctor Service. It all began with its founder, the Reverend John Flynn, back in 1912. With his able-bodied nurse and their camel, he decided that there had to be an easier way of providing medical aid to the people of the outback. Aircraft at that time were not suitable for ambulance work, and the radio was still in its infancy, but somehow they managed to get it started. Today, after more than 60 years in operation, this outback medical service is unequaled anywhere in the world. Each year, 140,000 patients consult the flying doctors by radio, and over 12,000 patients are flown to hospital. All of this is provided at no cost to the patient. The Alice Springs radio base is the control centre for the centre of Australia. It has more than 5,000 receiving stations. Now let's take a ride on the old Garn train. Just outside Alice, the local Preservation Society has created a train museum. They also provide daily joy rides into the desert on the old Garn train. The cookhouse has a coal range which makes great scones to go with the billy tea. This is just really a fun trip back into the past. The engine driver's father used to drive this train back in the 1930s. The next most important man on this train is Bill. He is an American from New Jersey. He works at the local satellite tracking station near Alice, and this is what Bill likes to do on his day off. After a quick check to see that the highway is clear, he turns on the warning lights. Now the train obviously has the right of way. For those who would like to hire this train, it is available for any social event, including a wedding, an on-board meeting, or perhaps even a funeral. Over the crossing, the train must wait for Bill to turn out the lights. You can see how he keeps in such good shape. Tracking trains or tracking satellites, Bill is the happiest man on the outback train, which really goes nowhere. A comfortable day's drive southwest of Alice is the true red centre of Australia and one of the world's natural wonders, Uluru, the Ayers Rock National Park. Most visitors stay in the small town of Ulara. It provides tourist accommodation at all levels, from budget campgrounds to world-class hotels, like the Sheraton Ulara, a true oasis in the desert. The only electricity here is the power of the sun from the many solar panels on the rooftops. The hotel's outback menu provides crocodile wafer, camel, Amidennes, and Chateaubriand buffalo. If you don't wish to venture into the heat of the desert, many of the desert plants and flowers and even some of the birds are right here in the Sheraton's hotel garden. Apart from air travel, the two most popular ways of seeing Australia are by tour coach or by camper van. To make this film, I drove one of these mini RVs 10,000 miles round trip from Sydney, and I managed to stay on the left side of the highway all the way. Late in the day, there's only one place to be, at the base of Ayers Rock. We've come to see the sunset on the world's greatest monolith, and here it is. The Rock of Ages, 1,100 feet high, simply called the Rock. This sacred landmark was recently given back to the Aboriginal people as part of the first Aboriginal-owned national park. It's jointly run with the Park Service. Most visitors come to see the rock at sunset when the glowing colours slowly fade to black. But I prefer the morning light after the sunrise. These almost perpendicular ridges were once horizontal beds of stone, which have gradually been thrust upwards over many millions of years. The Aboriginals believe that each surface pattern represents the imprints of ancestral beings during the dream time. The dream time is their version of the time of creation. Most visitors want to climb the rock. It's the thing to do. All you need is a good pair of walking shoes, a large sun hat, lots of sun cream, and a quart of drinking water for every hour of your journey, and it will take about 2 hours for the climb. For those who are not so energetic, there are easier guided walks around the base of the rock, with guides from the Park Service. The steepest part of the climb is at the beginning, but there is a strong chain fence to help you get started. As the climb becomes easier, I meet a young couple from England with their 2 young sons, a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old. I accompanied these folk right to the top of the rock, so if they can do it, I'm sure you can too. The most popular image of Australia is a sunburnt, parched landscape with vast empty spaces. While this is true for more than half of the continent, it ignores the fact that 85% of the Australian people live in the large coastal cities and the towns. To most Australians, the loneliness of the outback is, as yet, an untried experience. At the top, we have a visitor's book to sign, and I notice there's a young performer in this family. During my filming, I meet another couple with their grandchildren. They asked me to take their picture, which I did, and then they insisted on taking mine with my new t-shirt for my grandson back in Wellington, New Zealand. In the distance are the magical Olgas, 36 mountainous rocks. These are the most ancient mountains on Earth. The original name, Katajuta, means place of many domes. To the Aboriginal people, the outback is a mysterious world, shrouded in dreaming, a time when the spirits of their ancestors joined hands with the land to create the massive landforms of the Olgas and Ayers Rock. It is these spirits and legends of the dream time that make the outback one of the most powerful and mystical places on Earth. No visit to Australia is complete without an aerial view of Uluru National Park. So next morning we take a chopper ride. On board the chopper are 2 US visitors on their first outback adventure. They ask our pilot, how do we know when we are in the outback? The pilot replies, when there's nothing out there, you have arrived. From above, we see the Olgas in true perspective. Our young pilot turned out to be a New Zealander. He's been flying the rock for over 6 years. He also explains that the rock is like an iceberg. What we see is only the tip. Its oval circumference is over 6 miles around the base, but the rest of the rock is 3 miles underground. Over 300,000 visitors come to see the rock each year. After our visit to the Red Centre, we're now going to head south towards South Australia. The flat terrain of the outback begins to change its shape as we approach the opal country. Back in 1915, a young prospector named Willie Hutchison made the first discovery of precious opal in South Australia. In the small desert town with a rather unusual name of Coober Pedy, a vast opal mining industry has developed to make it the present-day opal capital of the world. It provides 80% of the world's opal. It's a patriotic little town. They even have the world's largest wishing well, and they're very fond of their animals. In the summer, the intense heat of the landscape here can be as high as 140 degrees. To beat the heat, the locals came up with the answer: to live and to work underground. Many of the houses, the opal stores, the hotels and motels, and even the churches are underground. There are 3,000 people living underground. You can even stay in an underground motel at a bedrock price. But the best way to see the town and learn about the mining of opals is to take the Gem City tour with Trevor McLeod. Trevor and his family also have an underground home, which is the first stop on the tour. His wife is finishing the housework before the visitors arrive. This is a daily ritual. Their 2 sons each have a bedroom carved out of the solid clay, as is the rest of the house. The visitors are fascinated to see the kitchen. Ventilation comes from fresh air pipes going up through the ceiling. I thought it would be dusty and maybe damp in this underground home, but it was really cozy, though I'm not sure that I could survive with only 2 outside windows. While his wife finishes the dishes, Trevor's taking us to the opal fields to try our hand at noodling. Before we begin, Trevor explains that it can be dangerous out here and we must heed the warning signs. Otherwise, you may stay on here as a permanent resident. And you must never walk backwards while taking a picture, or you may disappear down a mine shaft forever and no one would find you. There are over 3,000 deserted mine shafts. As we noodle amongst the dust piles, we're searching for opal chips that have been missed by the heavy machinery. If we strike it lucky, and many of the group do, the opal chips can be made into a variety of rings, earrings, brooches, and other forms of opal jewellery. In the underground museum back in the town, the colourful history of the opal is revealed. A guided walk through the mining tunnels 60 feet down gives us the feel of working underground. These tunnels were dug by the original miners, who mostly came from Europe. Now we understand the Aboriginal meaning of the name Coober Pedy. It means white man in a hole. There is some light at the end of the tunnel. It's the opal store waiting for us to invest some of our dollars. And there are no better opal prices anywhere in the world. The Romans first established opal as a true gemstone. They obtained their supplies from the Middle East. They valued the opal above all other gems, believing it to combine the beauty of all precious stones. Before leaving, we are invited to visit another underground home to meet one of Australia's most successful Aboriginal artists, Mr. David Brown. He's also a social worker with the Aboriginal people in the town. 2 years ago, David created his first Aboriginal dot painting, and when it sold for $2,000, he knew that he had talent. He's a very happy man, and tomorrow he will be even happier, because it's his wedding day. Tourists are not usually invited to a local wedding like this, but I was fortunate to film the event in the underground church with his family and friends. This is a complete contrast to a traditional outback Aboriginal wedding. The youngest flower girl is called Blossom in the dust. Directly opposite the church is the local football field. Here the young lads are warming up for a game of Aussie rules football. In the outback, Aussie rules means that you kind of make up the rules as you go along. There's not one blade of grass on this football field, and you want to see the golf course. They say you need a four-wheel drive just to get to it. The referee's name is Dusty, and here's Dusty's young son, who is also training for the game. His fancy footwork is a little shaky, but he really knows how to hold on to that ball. Next morning we depart with a soft spot in our hearts for this friendly desert town. Not everyone makes it when they come to the outback, as the wrecks on the roadside signify. Those two cyclists are from Germany, and they have another 1,000 miles still to pedal. What a great way to see Australia. As I head south, I meet a freight train heading west across the vast Nullarbor Desert. It's bound for Western Australia. It will take another 2 days for the crossing. And believe me, there is nothing out there all the way, except perhaps 1 million square miles of territory. Western Australia is the largest state. It's 1/3 of the entire country. With a state population of only 1.6 million, over 1 million people live in its capital, the impressive city of Perth. With its emphasis on the great outdoors, this sunny, easygoing young city is also called Australia at its best. If you like Sydney, you will love Perth. With its warm, temperate Mediterranean climate, it's also a year-round holiday destination. The first European to land here was the Dutch navigator Dirk Hartog back in 1616, but it was the British who finally took possession of Western Australia in 1829. The city of Perth is as close as you can get to an urban dream. It's clean and shiny, and with its low pressure of people, you may even think that it's Sunday during the week. The Australian lifestyle is regarded as being very relaxed, but in Perth it's really laid back. There may even be time for a snooze in the downtown. The symbol of Western Australia is the black swan on the state's coat of arms, and there's a river swan. As part of the city, there are many attractions on the Swan. Kings Park with its trees and tropical flowers on the Swan. Scenic bridges on the Swan and a well-planned freeway system. And for those in the fast lane, a glowing casino on the Swan. Most important of all, Western Australia's gem city way out west, Perth on the Swan. Heading back east from Perth, the next major city is Adelaide in South Australia. The city of Adelaide was laid out in this choice location according to the grand design of a British Army engineer, Colonel William Light, who founded the city in 1836. Today, with his degree of satisfaction, he looks over his creation. The one word to describe this city is conservatism. And there's also a degree of smugness about its people, who are quite convinced that they occupy one of the last truly civilized corners of the globe. As the capital of the state, it's also the ideal place to ignore the rest of the world, which it does quite happily. To get to know this city, you just walk the streets at a leisurely pace and you will begin to feel at home, perhaps in England. Stretching from Adelaide to the border with Victoria are the Murray lands. These are the lands of the Murray River. We're on our way towards the city of Melbourne. There are very few bridges over the Murray, but there are numerous river barges and ferry boats. But for visitors, the most relaxing way to experience the Murray River is on the old paddle steamer, the Melbourne. For the more adventurous, there are houseboats. These houseboats are also a popular way of cruising the Murray River at a leisurely pace. The larger boats are about the size of a small house or motel, but there are smaller, cosier models for honeymooners and for small families. With several locks on the river, we are fascinated to see how quickly the old machinery pumps out the water to lower the boat to the next level. The original steam boiler is stoked with timber by the engineer as he tends the ancient engine. This drives the paddle wheels directly. After 60 years as a workhorse for a timber company hauling logs on the river, the Melbourne was restored 20 years ago as a paddle steamer for cruising. Now this Murray River seems to be just a great place for fishing, swimming, boating and relaxing, to just take life easy. Some Aussies call it the river of no worries. Others, the Nile of Australia. Now we're going to visit Queen Victoria, in amongst the roses, as she watches over her Victorian city of Melbourne, capital of the state of Victoria, Australia. The first Melbournians were not convicts, but free and willing settlers who set out to plan an elegant city on the banks of the Yarra River. Although it was not a penal settlement like Sydney and Brisbane, the city became wealthy almost overnight. The discovery of gold further inland in 1851 changed Melbourne dramatically. It became the port for the goldfields. To maintain law and order, they needed a jail, and so they built one in the centre of the city, and it took up a full city block. It's still there. So now let's visit the original Melbourne jail. This is where Australia's most notorious bushranger spent his last days, Ned Kelly of the Kelly Gang. His original pistol and suit of armour are still next to his cell. In 1880, Ned took his last look at the prison ceiling. He faced the hangman, and the trap door was released. After the hanging, a plaster cast was taken of his face. a grotesque but grim deterrent to future offenders. Melbourne today is a modern global village of some 3 million people and over 100 different nationalities, and it is a city of grace and charm. There is a lot of cultural competition between the big cities in Australia. Melbourne regards itself as the country's capital for culture and the performing arts, but this is always challenged by the festive city of Adelaide. But I'm not going to pass judgment here. When John Bates, an early settler from Tasmania, rowed his boat up the Yarra River in 1835, he knew that he had found the perfect site for the new southern city. 2 years later, he named it Melbourne in honour of Lord Melbourne, the British Prime Minister. Today, the streets are still wide and stately and are lined with some of the world's best Victorian architecture. No visit to Melbourne is really complete without a ride on a local tram. During their 100-year history, these streetcars have become more than just a pollution-free, convenient form of commuter transport. They have become a way of life. As the colourful trams trundle their way along the tree-lined boulevards, they are a much-loved symbol of the city. For visitors, the best place to go tram watching is Flinders Street Railway Station. You can even tell what time it is somewhere else. With low fares and frequent service, tram riding is an excellent way for visitors to go sightseeing. There's even a quality restaurant tram. Most cities around the world phased out their trams during the 1950s, but Melbourne still has 700 trams and over 200 miles of track. It's the biggest and most efficient tram system in the world, and it's still expanding. It doesn't take long for a visitor to realise that these Australians take their war history very seriously. So let's visit the Shrine of Remembrance on the hill before we leave. This Melbourne policeman is actually on military duty guarding the shrine, and it's a serious business, but underneath there must be an Aussie smile. Melbourne has to be a touch of London down under. A 1-hour flight south from Melbourne is Australia's only island state of Tasmania, affectionately called Tassie. Although it's faithfully Australian, it's very separate. The friendly Tassie people tend to regard Australia as that small island north of Tasmania. In the capital of Hobart, the state governor's castle, or residence, has a great view over the harbour and the city, which are only a few minutes away. Tasmania is named after that famous Dutch navigator, Abel Tasman, who discovered this island gem back in 1642. He was really on his way to discover New Zealand. Today, visitors come to explore this land of heritage and enjoy a wide variety of outdoor activities. Life in the downtown is orderly and relaxed. There is even time for a game of chess in the park. They tend to move slowly down here. Historically, the port city of Hobart is of great significance as Australia's second oldest capital. It was founded in 1804. Everywhere you go, the past steps out to meet you, but the present is never far away. The casino is also a major attraction, together with the city's many restaurants. After a scenic drive to the top of Mount Wellington, we head south to the Tasman Peninsula by way of Australia's oldest bridge at Richmond. Any visit to to Tasmania should include Port Arthur and its infamous convict settlement. Back in 1840, most of the worst convicts in the British colonies of Australia were sent to prison here for the severest form of hard labour and punishment. The settlement began as a timber station where 150 convicts cut trees, erected houses in wood and stone. They built workshops, a hospital and barracks for the soldiers who guarded them. They lived under the constant threat of the lash and an experimental isolation system that often drove them to madness. Escape was rare, and many stayed on to the end of their lives. The settlement eventually closed after 40 years as prison outpost for the Empire. Today, Port Arthur is one of Australia's most historic sites, a symbol of its convict heritage. Between Melbourne and Sydney is the nation's capital of Canberra. At the time of Australia's federation, there was great rivalry between Melbourne and Sydney as to which would take the honour of the nation's capital. After many disputes, both were denied the privilege. Instead, a separate capital territory was created in a wide fertile valley between the rivaling states. In hindsight, this was a brilliant move. From a tenuous beginning, the foundation was laid for the stunningly beautiful city of Canberra that we see today. The city was founded in 1913 and was based on the vision of an American architect from Chicago, Walter Burley Griffin. The highlight of Canberra's history was the opening of the new billion-dollar Parliament in 1988. The Australian Parliament is based on the British Westminster system. They honour the Queen, they have a Prime Minister and two houses. The House of Representatives from across the nation and a Senate with state and territorial members. Within the interior are many major works of art that portray the country's history, like the Eureka Stockade. This was Australia's only internal revolution back in 1854. On the goldfields of Ballarat, 500 diggers built a stockade to defend their rights. 300 government troops attacked the sleeping miners at dawn, and it was all over in 15 minutes. 24 miners and 6 soldiers died, but the miners eventually won their rights. Mark Twain visited Australia, and he described Eureka as the finest event in Australian history, a victory won through a battle lost. In the suburbs of Canberra are the embassies and the high commissions of more than 70 foreign countries. These foreign residents enrich the character of Canberra. The first was a glimpse of China, and this is Papua New Guinea, and a touch of Thailand down under. Close by is the High Commission for India. The United States was the first of the non-Commonwealth embassies to arrive here back in 1944 with an elegant Georgian-style touch of Williamsburg, Virginia. After we cruise the lake, there's perhaps time for a picnic lunch on the lakeshore. But the highlight of our visit to Canberra will surely be the Australian War Memorial. As well as being the world's finest war museum, it's also a national tribute to the men and women who gave their lives for Australia in 9 separate wars during the past century. Today, I'm meeting survivors from the Battle of Crete during World War II. They have come to honour their fallen friends in a simple but moving ceremony. We shall remember them. In the surrounding galleries are 100,000 names of those who gave up their gift of life for their country. There are tributes to the unknown soldier and portrayals of Navy and Air Force. There are grim reminders of World War II at a time when Australians, New Zealanders and Americans fought together in the Pacific. Without America, Australia and New Zealand would have fallen to the Japanese. The indebtedness of these two countries has never diminished. But America too was grateful, as your monument testifies. As our colourful day in Canberra draws to a close, so does our visit to this bush capital. We climb to the overview for one final sunset, and now we're going to return to Sydney for a special event. It's January the 26th, Australia Day, the nation's birthday. The Sydney Youth Orchestra accompanies this grand finale. The colourful fireworks are symbolic of the youthfulness of this young nation. The sparkling grandeur of its scenic beauty, the vibrant colours of nature and of the outback, and above all the warmth and sparkling friendship of the people of Australia, this land of Oz, this wonder down under, this truly amazing Australia.